Pretty sweet. Now we're going to go ahead and put a lot of these skills together in the form of an actual search. Now with a search button, you would have some sort of query. So let's say, for instance, you want to type out working image and you would search it. And this should go to its own view, like it'd be its own view that would handle the actual search itself. And of course, when I entered this search, a question mark was added here. So let's go ahead and take a look at our nav bar and into the actual search form that's in there. So my input, I have this search. I'm going to go ahead and give it a name. That name is just going to be Q. That's often what you'll see with a search bar, is the name being Q. So now if I type out working image, it now has an argument in here, Q equaling to working plus image. Now if I change the action, I'm not sure if it works anymore, but if you change the action to google.com, possibly even with search added to it, refresh in here and say like beach image and hit enter, it takes you over to Google. Notice that you can't actually search like that, so maybe let's put just Q. Yeah, so it just pre-fills the data now. It doesn't actually perform the search. So if you hit enter, you would actually perform the search. So that's, one of those things about action. You can change where it's going to go. So in this case, I really do need it because on my local page, I want it to go to that search URL all the time, no matter what page it's on, because the nav bar is going to be on every page. So I want to make sure that this goes to that search page. So now when I do it and do working image, it now goes to a search view. And of course, this page is not found. So let's go ahead and make it. Now in my case, like I said, we're going to put together a lot of the things that we've done. I'm going to go ahead and do Python manage.py, start app, searches. Now this app, we're going to go ahead and make a model. And we'll call it class search query. Takes in models.model. We'll say user, and we'll say what the query is, and we'll do a timestamp, like when it happened. Now to add in the user, we do from Django.conf. We're going to import the settings, and the user is going to be models.foreign key settings.auth user model. Blank equals to true, null equals to true. The query, this is going to be a char field. Let's do max length of 220. And I don't want it to be blank, so I'll just leave it like that. And then timestamp models.date time field auto now add equals to true. Great, so I have a model. Let's go ahead and make sure my app is in the settings. So in here, we called it searches. Save that. Let's go ahead and run our migration. So Python manage.py, make migrations. And of course, we've got this on delete issue. We've seen that before. Of course, on delete. And this is models.set null. Something I really like about Django is it does give me a lot of these very verbose errors. Next thing is make migrations and then migrate. Since I made that model, I might as well add it into my admin as well. So we'll do from.models, import the model name, then admin.site.register, and we register that model name. Now all of this is because of my view, right? I actually want to create a view here, and I'll call this the search view, and it takes in a request, and then naturally it's going to return, render, and takes in the request again. The template name in this case, I'll just call it search/view.html, and I'll put empty context for now. Since I did that, I'm going to go ahead and put this template in here called templates. Inside of the templates, I'm going to make another new folder called search, or rather searches, to fit with the app name for both of them. And then inside of searches, we'll call it view.html. This view is going to extend from base.html. And then we're going to go ahead and put our block content in here and in block. And I'll go ahead and do a div class of column or row first. So just adding in some of our bootstrap stuff in here. And we'll do a div class of column 10, or rather column 12, column 8 mx auto. Okay. And then I'll just do p class of lead and say you searched for, and we'll put a query in here. And then I need to put in my results. So back into my view, we'll go ahead and say query equals to, well, to get the query, we can use the request.get param, and I can use .get and then the name of the query that I'm using. Now, if we go back into that nav bar, we used a name already. We put it in as Q. So if I called this query, you would put this in as query. Okay, but I'm going to keep it in as Q. Again, that's fairly common. And then I'm going to set a default value of none, right? So this right here is looking into the request get dictionary, looking for the key of Q. If it doesn't have one, it's going to set it equal to none. So now I can put this in as my context. Let's go ahead and call it context. Okay, and then the next thing is I'll go ahead and import my model. So from .models, we're going to import the search query model. And I'm going to start out with user being none. And we'll say if request.user.is authenticated, then the user is the request.user. And now I'll just go ahead and do search query.objects.create, user equals to user, query equals to query, or that keyword, right? And if you wanted to make it less confusing, you can use Q. So this will actually save that query every single time. With my search view, I don't need to make URLs for this app because it's really just one view. I'll bring it into my main project URLs. And we'll do from searches.views import search view. And then we'll make an endpoint for search with path search and then our search view there. There we go. Cool. So far, so good, hopefully. Let's go ahead and run this server. And let's try that search. Hey, what do you know? You searched for working image. Great. So we actually just did a bunch of things quickly, but a bunch of things you should now be very comfortable with. If all of that was uncomfortable, you might want to go back and watch different sections of this, but I did it really, really quickly. So we're actually now ready to do a more complex lookup using this search query, as we've seen. Now, the reason I actually created a model is sometimes you might want to monitor what queries are coming through and by whom. This is a way to do that. You can then go into your actual admin and look at those search queries and see what queries or what people are looking for altogether. Right? Now, of course, if I have no query here, I get this error. So what I want to do then is actually just say if query is not none, then we do that. Because we can't have, it says not null constraint, I can't have that query field as null. So really, I only want to show that up if there is an actual query. So we save everything, go back in here, we searched for none. So one final step really for this is to say if query, then we will show that query. Otherwise, we can just bring in that form again. And that's exactly what I'll do. So the form being what's in the nav bar. And in here. And there we go. All right. So now new search, do that search, and what do you know? Pretty cool. Now for our final feature of this, we're going to have a query that actually looks up stuff in the database. So let's go ahead and jump into our blog model. And I'm going to go ahead and make a model manager called search. And it's going to take in self and query being none. Okay, so if the query is none, we'll just say if query is none, then we'll just return self.getQuerySet.none. It's just a way to return the query set of this type. Otherwise, we're going to return the self.getQuerySet. And, well, I want to also have a search method up here because for the same reasons of published, I might want to have the ability to search things. So self and query. And this one, I'll go ahead and return initially self.filter and say title iExact that query. Okay, so then we would pass in this query here. And with my search, I also want to make sure that they are only published items. So I'll go ahead and do .published as well, which we'll call this right here. So then it'll say inside of things that are published, go ahead and do this search. Okay, so now that we've got that, let's go back into our view here. And we'll do from blog.models import blog post. And now our actual query set, or the blog list, equals to blogpost.objects.search query equaling to that query. All right, so we have that .search because I made it a model manager. I also made it a custom query set so we could do it on other things. So I could also do .all.search. Okay, so this is our blog list now. What I'm going to do first is actually move my context up a little bit. And then in here, I'll give my context of being blog list equaling to blog list. Not a big deal here because then in my view, we can tab this in a little bit. And I'll go ahead and say for blog item in blog list in for. And much like we've seen before, we can include our blog stuff. Okay, so blog post in this case is blog item, truncate true, detail false. Okay, so we save that. We do a search for working image. What do you know? It's working. Now, what if I did a search for it's working? That's not actually coming in. Now, a way I could fix that is by changing this from title to content and refresh. And it's still not coming through. So let's try I contains. And I contains worked. It actually showed me it's working. So this is a little bit of a problem, and that's where these complex lookups come in. So we use something called a Q lookup. So from Django.models import Q. That's capital Q. So we can actually chain different lookups together. So we can say the lookup equals to Q and title underscore underscore I contains that query. Or with that pipe there, we can do Q content contains that query. And we put these into some parentheses there. And now I have a more complex lookup that I can pass in to my query or to my filter itself. And of course, they can be chained and have more things in here, like you could also include the slug, right? And the reason I'm using I contains is because we just want to check if this query is within this field. So slug. Okay, so now that we've got that, let's refresh again. Again, it's working. And now if I do a search for working image, again, it's working. Now I could also go one step further and say that I want to look up maybe my user, like the author, right? So let's go ahead and say user and first name I contains query. Or, and notice that they are double underscores here, or we could do last name. Or you could do the username or email or, right? So this gives me a nice complex lookup for this item here. And now if I search, let's say CFE, it searched for CFE. I did email. Let's change it back to username or change it to username. And there, now I can actually get all of the published items from this user. And this is also even more clear when I do this search and I'm not logged in. Right? And it does it in the same order. Everything's in the same order as the publish date themselves, right? And it's using all of the things that we've come together. But now we have a much more complex lookup and a way to actually do a robust search for our project. Now, this is also where you can start thinking about how to do different kinds of views. Now that I can do this more complex search, that's really just a more complex way of doing these things. You don't always have to do it in the sense of like it's a search view and it's actually running some search. All right, so that's it. We have now created a very functional blog. I realize there's some things that are missing, and we'll talk about that in the next one. But just keep in mind that all of the stuff that we've learned here can be built on top of, and this is where you would then start taking a lot more stuff related to Django. But I will leave you with a challenge before we talk about what's next. And that challenge would be to actually do everything we did, but for comments, like making comments on any given post. I think that you can do that now because you've learned a lot about how to associate user data, making forms, and all that. So that's where I leave you. Thanks so much for watching Try Django 2.2. I realize we went through a lot in this series, and I do encourage you to break things. Like the only way you're really going to learn is by, number one, coding and doing the things that hopefully you did that whole time. And then number two is actually breaking things, like trying new things and then getting into a state where it feels like it's unsolvable. That is where you're going to have a lot of growth. And then finally, one of the main reasons I focused on this being a blog is so you can actually start sharing the things you learn. We need more people teaching Django. That way we can all understand it on a much deeper level. I think that's really important as well. So anyways, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.